Well, my name is Robert Arend, and I was born in Toledo, Ohio on June 4th, 1932.
So did your go through there?
I went through schooling in Ohio. In fact, I was in the University of Toledo at the time the Korean War broke. I graduated high school in 1950.
Do you remember how you came to know the breakout of the Korean War?
I'm trying to remember. It was either radio or newspaper. I'm not sure just which.
Mm-hmm.
But at the time, I had no idea where Korea was.
And you didn't know nothing about Korea?
I knew nothing about Korea at the time.
And you said that you were in the University of Toledo, right?
I graduated high school in June of '50.
Mm-hmm.
Then I became a student at the University of Toledo that fall, which would be, I guess, September of 1950.
So what did you study?
I was studying business law. Shortly after I became a member of a student at the university, I joined the Ohio State National Guard.
Uh-huh.
A friend of mine was in, he convinced me to join. And shortly thereafter, which would have been it was 1951.
Mm-hmm.
In the fall of 1951, the Ohio National Guard was activated to regular service.
So what kind of, in the National Guard, what kind of training did you receive?
At that time, I was just basic training in the National Guard at that time. And when we were activated, we went to Louisiana for training, and I became involved in office work at that time.
Office work?
Mm-hmm.
What type?
I was doing in the intelligence section.
Mm-hmm.
Then I went to school for personnel work, and I learned the Army personnel. That's when I was shipped to Korea as a personnel specialist. I was at Camp Polk in Louisiana, and received my orders to go to Korea.
Mm-hmm.
I went to Camp Stoneman in San Francisco area.
Mm-hmm.
And left from there by boat to Korea.
Any anecdotes that you want to share in the ship? You were in the Pacific Ocean?
I was on a ship in the Pacific Ocean, and I think from the time we left San Francisco until we hit Yokohama, it stormed the entire trip. I was sick. Oh, I was so sick.
Oh, really?
I was so sick I wanted to die, and I was afraid I was going to.
Oh.
And we arrived in Yokohama, and we were taken off the ship and went to, I don't know what camp it was there close by, and drew all our combat gear, uniforms, rifle, etc., and spent the night in Yokohama in a barracks, and then back on the same ship in the morning, and went around and came into Incheon.
Do you remember when you left for Korea?
It was early December.
Of 1951?
52.
Oh. So tell me about the first scene of Incheon when you landed. What did you see and how was it? How was Korea? People, house, and scenes.
When we landed or came into Incheon, got off the boat, off the ship, into a small landing craft, and took us to the beach. And I'm sure I remember, and I'm almost 100% sure we had to climb a seawall to get in.
What?
A seawall to get onto the beach and up
Uh-huh.
farther. And then this was all in the late afternoon, and we went up the beach into the town to some extent. I don't recall a whole lot of it, but I do remember that we went into a railroad yard, and we spent the night in the railroad yard. And I recall I was on guard duty basically, and it was pitch black, and I recall sitting on the ground with my back to a railroad wheel, and I don't think I moved the entire night. It was so black, and I could hear artillery going overhead, and I could hear small arm fire going around different
Oh,
areas.
really? In that near the railroad yard near to Incheon?
Yes.
So still battle was going
There
on?
was still some going on there. And like I say, I knew I was just petrified. I was so frightened all night.
So that was the nightmare, the first night. So what were you thinking? You wanted to go back, or you regret? Did you enlist, or you were drafted, right?
Well, I was in the National Guard.
Right, so
we were
reactivated,
activated.
so it's more like a drafted, right?
Pretty much.
Mm-hmm.
And I wasn't all that happy to be there. Not a pleasant place. All I know is I was frightened. I was scared.
So next morning, what happened to you?
The next morning, they put us on a train, and we went south to Taegu.
Uh-huh.
And I spent some time in Taegu. And recalling all that's a little difficult. I spent some time in Taegu, and then from there, I went to Busan.
So Daegu was just short stop.
It was just a few days.
Uh-huh.
And I was basically infantry at that time. And then went back to...
By the way,
yes.
Did you write a letter about your first night to your family?
I'm sure I did. I'm sure I did. Later, not that night.
Uh-huh.
But I say the only thing I recall vividly about that night, that first night, was the complete fear.
Uh-huh.
It was so black I couldn't see my hand in front of my face, and I held my rifle with the round in the chamber.
So, what happened in Busan?
Busan, I was sent to a distribution camp, a repo depot, we call them, replacement depot. And from there, I think I spent 2 or 3 days there. I'm not entirely sure. Then I was assigned to go to Koje-do.
When was it? It's 1953.
This was 52.
Still nine. No, you said that you went to Korea early December of 1952.
Right.
It should be 51 then you left.
51 is when we were activated. In December of 51 is when we were activated, and I spent 9 months, 10 months in Louisiana at 52. Then I was given a 30-day leave, and then I had to be in San Francisco, Camp Stoneman, in early December of 52. So I went. Yeah, it was still December of 52 when I arrived in Korea.
And when you were assigned to Koje-do?
Koje-do, it was still 52,
Mm-hmm.
December.
So did you know anything about Koje-do at the time that you were assigned?
No, I didn't. I really didn't. I had heard a few stories about Koje-do being the United Nations Command prisoner war camp. And some of the stories I heard weren't all that pleasant. But I didn't know a great deal about it. I have no idea what all it encompassed. I had no idea how many prisoners were there, anything about it until I arrived there.
So tell me about your life in Koje-do, your mission, your service, and the things that are happening there, things that you still remember, things that you want to erase in your memory.
Some things to erase, indeed. When I arrived in Koje-do, I was assigned the primary job of personnel specialist for officers' records.
Officers' record meaning what?
Meaning all the records of the military records. I took care of their personnel files.
Of the prisoners?
No, of the Americans.
Oh, okay. And just keep...
And I did that job. Also, we all had a secondary job. And my secondary job to start with was a member of a machine gun squad. And we would periodically go out to the hills and set up our machine gun in different areas we were ready in case of guerrilla attacks or whatever the case may be. Then shortly after that, I was assigned to become a rifle squad leader.
Mm-hmm.
And again, I'd take my rifle squad, and we'd go through the hills, just looking and exploring to see what. And then the war was still going on, and I had some contact. Periodically, I'd be called to go with a few of the people that were in charge of the different prison camps, the compounds, and we'd go inspect the compounds. We'd go into the compound and check the prisoner barracks, the huts that the prisoners lived in. We'd inspect those and check it for contraband to see what they were doing. And this was shortly after. I wasn't there when they had the big uprising when the prisoners captured the general and a few guys. I was there just shortly after. So it was a little tense to be going in the compounds, but we would go in and check things out.
Give me some details or of scenes so that the audience might have a pretty good idea of what camp looked like, how people behaved, how dangerous, why, what they eat, how their clothing, all these things.
Well, the compounds, the entire valley was full of what we call a compound. It'd be separate areas. We'd have 2,000 or 3,000 prisoners in each compound. They'd be separated by a very small distance. There'd be another compound.
How many compounds?
I don't recall how many compounds there were. Totally, we had almost 70,000 prisoners. And along with that 70,000 prisoners, that included one compound that was women. We had roughly 3,000 women prisoners also. They were captured by our troops at the front lines. And some were actual combatants, and some were support people.
Wow, so there was a combatant?
Oh, yeah.
Female?
Yes. and they tried. I was in on quite a bit of the segregation, where we would try to separate the prisoners based on their political belief. There were communist and there were non-communist. And we tried our best to separate the non-communists into separate compounds, because periodically the prisoners in the hardcore compounds, they would find somebody among their midst that was non-communist. And usually, quite often, what they would do, they would take that person, they'd go outside in the open area, and they'd form up more or less, they'd form up lines, several lines, and they'd start singing and swaying. And while this was going, while they were singing and carrying on, in the middle of their group, they'd have one or two non-communists, and they would proceed to kill them.
How? They
And
didn't have a gun, right?
they would kill them by hand. They would have knives. They would have anything they could use. We used to used to take a lot of knives. They'd use tent poles for spears. But what they would do, they would throw the body over the fence to us. And when it started to get really wild, when we knew they were on the verge of trying to break out, then we did use gas to calm them down, to quell the riot. I have pictures of the gas we used, and it would pretty well calm it down for the time being. There were a few times when they did manage to break some of the compounds, or one or two that they would actually break through the fence, and our troops were there to stop them.
When these communists killed non-communist
Yes.
prisoners,
Mm-hmm.
what did you do? Did you punish them? Did you find it out, or did you interrogate them?
No, most of the time there was no. When they did this, there'd be 1,000 or 2,000 in this group that were carrying on, and like I say, the major thing was to try to stop it by using the gas we used. There wasn't a whole lot of retribution we could do to them, and again, like I said, the major thing was to try to get those out of there that were professed to be non-communist. On a general rule, they were pretty decent, pretty well behaved. And I've talked to a lot of them, those we could talk to, and surprisingly ran across quite a few of the prisoners that had some knowledge of English, and they could speak to us. And the funniest part thing I ever saw one day in a kitchen, I was joking with this one prisoner. He had I guess you'd call them a dragonfly, a big insect. They were about over there, pretty good size. He had a string tied to it, and had a big pot, had these big army pots they were cooking in. He had a pot of rice cooking on the stove, and he'd take this dragonfly, he'd fly it through the soup, swing him around, dip him in the soup, and the thing would shake his wings and fly around some more and back. We stood there and laughed at that. It was funny. The best thing I collected one day, I donated that to the museum. This one prisoner had taken a poncho, a rubber rain poncho, and he had melted the rubber off. He had a piece about 18 inches long, about 12 inches wide, roughly. He had melted the rubber off, and he had just the cloth interior, something like a canvas almost, and it painted from memory And what he used for paint, I have no idea. But he painted a beautiful picture of Georgy Malenkov, who at that time was the Russian premier. It was a great picture. And I kept that, and that's one of the things I donated last year to the museum.
So that was not Stalin. It's Malenkov.
Malenkov, yeah, Georgy Malenkov. He was the premier for a short time in Russia.
How dangerous to go in through and inspect the camp?
Oh, there was some danger to it. I'm sure there was danger to it. We'd go in without weapons.
Without weapons?
Mm-hmm.
Why? Oh, they might take it.
In case they overpowered us and they'd have the weapon. But standing close by and just on the outside, we'd have these South Koreans, the Katusas, they were called, Korean Army trained by U.S. Army,
Uh-huh.
and they were the primary guards on the prison compounds. They'd be real close by.
Uh-huh.
If there was a few that we felt were too dangerous to go in, then of course we didn't go in. But most of them were pretty good. We could go in. Actually, it wasn't that bad, I don't think. They had nice barracks to live in. Like I say, they slept on these wooden pallets with the rice mats, which was the way I assume they always had. They were clean. They had showers. They had a nice kitchen, good clothes, and they had sports equipment to play with when they desired, so balls, basketballs, and they would gather, play games, or just sit around. But the Red Cross would inspect periodically. The National Red Cross, International Red Cross, would come through and make an inspection. And they would see to it that the prisoners had decent clothes and the sports equipment to play with.
What do you mean by shower? Hot shower?
To some extent, yeah.
How often?
I don't recall how often they did, but they had a room, had a little building they could shower in. Like I say, and their clothes they were all given clean clothes, and they took care of their own laundry. They did their own laundry, and their own cooking, so they did well.
You said that you were not there at the time that there was a big uprising and the death of the American general.
Right. That was
But can you tell me about those things, if you know of those?
I don't know a whole lot. I talked to some fellows that had been there at the time. It was a blunder on the general's part to go in. They went in to talk to this one communist leader. I can't remember his name. And they went in to talk with him and actually bring him out, I think. And in the course of their being in there, the prisoners overpowered and kept them. They were there, I don't remember, 2 days, 3 days, I don't recall how long it was. But ended up we sent in some troops and a tank in to get them out.
So he was
actually a prisoner, yeah.
so out of there alive?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So he was not killed?
No, he was not killed, no. Mm-hmm. There were a few prisoners that were killed. Mm-hmm. But I don't recall. It seems like there was at least 1 or 2 American soldiers killed. I'm not sure. I don't recall for sure. But the general himself was brought out alive. And then from then on, there was no major officers went in.
What is POW camp of Koje-do to you?
Prisoners, I think, were there. Well, of course, they were captured in the battlefield. But so many of them, I think, were happy to be there. The ones that were non-communist. They were very friendly with us, and anxious not to go back to North Korea. Those that were hardcore, they wanted to go back and would do anything in their power to get back if they possibly could. When the hostilities ceased, when the war ended, I was on the team then that did all the paperwork for the transfer, did all the shipping records, made record of all those that were there, and saw to that they were shipped by the records we had, by the names we had. We also kept...
Shipped to where?
They were shipped up to the Panmunjom area.
Mm-hmm.
And we kept records of all those that we transferred. We kept a record, a card file for every prisoner. I had a card file, his name, rank, where he went. Then we had the shipping records and saw that each one was called to be, it was on the record. And it was quite an intense time. So many of them wanted to cause trouble on the return, which I couldn't understand. They were being shipped back where they wanted to go, but they wanted one last time to take a shot at the Americans.
Because that will serve them as a kind of medal or the evidence of their loyalty to the North Korean authority.
Yes. They, I don't know how many threats I received that we will get you, you know. And I know some of the fellows there at the camp. I was one of them. Our names were turned into Peking, China, and classified as war criminals because we were at the camp, because we were involved in the transfer of the communists back to North Korea and separated the non-communists, and they were sent to other areas. And
the non-communists sent to where?
They were sent to other areas. Some were left in South Korea, and I know some were sent to Vietnam in that area.
Card file for every prisoner.
Right. I had those made.
What's in there in card?
In the card is just a regular file card, 3x5 file card we had made. And we had their name and their service number, serial number, and what where they were transferred to, whether it be North Korea or wherever they were. And that I had an office where I had we made the shipping rosters and these cards. 4 or 5 of the Katusa worked in there with me. They did all the writing in Korean script. It was all done, of course, on mimeograph forms, and then the shipping rosters were, of course, printed off the mimeograph forms.
What else in the card? Did you divide the group or categorize the group into communist, non-communist? Did you have that column?
We did, not color, just it was all basic card, but we did keep them separate.
No, in the card.
Oh,
did you actually write that?
Yes, it was.
This prisoner was communist and non-communist and so on?
We separated by like say communist or non-communist. On the non-communist card, there was a how do we put it? NKO, I think it was. We had a it's hard to remember that.
So communist or the non-communist was the biggest criteria dividing up and categorizing all different groups.
Exactly. We had the list of all their names, and then we put those on 2 shipping rosters, like I say, and then from there, the Katusas we'd put them in English, and then the Katusa would write right alongside the name in Korean, and the same on these cards we kept. We wrote it in English, and right beside it, everything was done in Korean.
Priority of the mission of this management.
Well, of course, the main priority was to keep these fellows as prisoners, but there was a lot of main priority. One of the main priorities, again, like I say, was to separate those that were and were not communist. We wanted desperately to keep those that were non-communist away from the non-communists, or from the communists, and keep them from going back to a communist country where they would be, I'm sure, dispatched. So many of them, of course, those that professed to be non-communist, they desperately did not want to go back. They had not joined the army of their own free will to start. So, and a lot of them had families back there which they were concerned with, but still they did not want to go back and be part of that regime.
Were they able to write letters?
They were able to write letters, yes.
So there is an address system there too?
There was.
Uh-huh.
Mm-hmm. They were well taken care of. Irregardless of what North Korea might have said or does say, the prisoners we had, irregardless of their political opinion, they were all well treated. They were very well treated. Albeit the fact they were prisoners with limited ability to do anything other than in their own little compound, but still they were well treated.
So they were actually happy rather than being in the front line and might be being killed.
I think they were happy, as a rule. Again, like I say, there's always those hardcore that any way they could have, they would have caused damage to any American they got a hold of.
Who cooked the food for the prisoners?
They cooked their own food.
So you provide the materials?
We provided the material, and they did the cooking.
How was your life there in Koje?
It was good. We had decent quarters. Food was pretty decent, although we were somewhat confined, of course, to the island. But we were all given an opportunity to leave for a few days on what we call the R&R. And I went to Japan for a few days. And all in all, it was good. There were many, many frightening times, but at the same time, that was to be expected. We were in a combat zone.
Where did you sleep?
We had little what they call Quonset huts. That's what we slept in.
And the bed you had?
I had a regular folding army cot, the canvas cot.
Yeah.
Hard as a rock.
Who cooked the food for you guys?
Oh, we had our own kitchen, our own cooks.
American or Korean?
All American.
All American?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. What was your favorite menu?
It's hard to say what my favorite was. My least favorite was the fact that the meats all came frozen, so there was just a limited amount of what they could ship to us frozen. So we had a lot of turkey, we had a lot of liver, and ground meats. But all in all, the food was decent.
Yeah, I mean, it's during the war, right?
Yeah. All things considered.
How much were you paid and what was your rank there in the Koje Island?
Pay, I don't recall what my pay scale was. I was a corporal.
Uh-huh.
But
about 120 something?
It seemed like I got, it's hard to recall. It seems like I got around, of course, part of my pay was sent home. I was married.
Oh, you were married?
I had gotten married just a couple months prior to being inducted into the Army. So part of my pay was held back and sent to my wife. I think I got something around $70 a month, if I recall. I could be way off base, but I'm not 100% sure.
How was Korean society and Korean people's life in Koje Island? Were there Korean people working for the camp?
There were Koreans working for the camp, yes, there were. And we had some Korean young fellows that worked in the kitchen. They helped with the cleanup. We had some young fellows that were, we call them houseboys, basically, but they would pretty much try to keep our huts clean. We had very little contact with civilian Koreans. There was one town, small village, I went into a couple times and talked with a few people there. There was another, by this small town, there was an orphanage. And there were lots of little Korean children. And we went there a couple of times and took them oranges and some candies and whatever we could to kind of make their life a little nicer. I'd seen in my trips from Incheon to Busan, like I said, I stopped in Daegu for a while in Busan. I saw a lot of Korean children that appeared to be orphans or not, I'm not sure, but they looked to me like they were pretty well destitute, begging for candy or whatever, and we'd give them candy, whatever we could. And then on Koje-do, I saw no children other than at this orphanage. And they really tore our hearts apart, to all these little guys that obviously had no families. This one here is a picture of me with a couple of the kids. We went one day and there was a Red Cross lady went with us, and she had these little party favors, paper hats and noisemakers, and they got a kick out of that. We gave them candy and oranges, and it was fun, and we were just so happy to make their day pleasant for them. But it was really neat. This is a couple of the children with their hats and noisemakers.
Did you give that noisemaker or what?
It was sad and it was fun, both, to go to this orphanage. It was so sad to see these little guys with the life they had.
So when did you leave Korea?
I left Korea in November of 1953.
From Koje?
Yeah, I went from Koje to Busan, and I was on a ship out of Busan to Seattle, Washington. Yeah.
Directly, not by way of Japan?
No, straight through, straight from Busan to Seattle, Washington. 14-day trip.
Do you remember the day that the armistice was signed so that war is over?
I do remember exactly the date. I'm not 100%. It was July 27th, was it?
Yeah.
But we were quite pleased. We had a month or so earlier, I think it was in May or June, I don't recall when, but there was rumors of a truce, and it turned out to be totally false. And we all thought, oh, wow, the war is over, this is great, we can get these guys back home and we can go home. But it turned out to be false. And then when the actual armistice was signed there in July 27, we were a little apprehensive then. Is this real or is it not? And fortunately, it turned out to be a real happening. So we were happy. We were pleased. There were still problems. Some of the prisoners still were acting up and causing problems, and they did until the day they were shipped out. But that was just their way of getting back at us, I guess.
What was the most difficult thing for your service during Koje?
So much of it was difficult. One was the deaths. Several times I saw prisoners after they had been killed by their own people. Well, like I say, one of the things that bothered me the most was the little kids at the orphanage. The fact that these guys, my thought was, what opportunities do they have? Their country has been torn apart by war. What's going to become of them? There were times when we were under threat of attack. There were guerrillas in the hills, and I'm sure they came from the mainland. There was one part of Koje that was fairly close to mainland Korea.
Yeah.
I think they came across there and then down through the hills.
So they actually attacked you guys?
There were a couple times when we had guerrilla activity. Of course, our biggest fear always was, are these guys going to break out of the compounds? And if they do, they sure got us outnumbered.
How many Katusas and all UN forces there?
I don't recall. I mean, we had
kind of ratio.
I would say, it was probably, we had 70,000, roughly 70,000 prisoners. And I would say at the most we had probably, maybe 5,000, and I would guess no more than 5,000 American Katusas. So it was fairly well outnumbered had it come to that point.
Have you been back to Korea?
We went back to Korea.
When?
It was in 2010, 4 years ago. We went back the first part of June. Actually, we went back on the 4th of June, which was my birthday. And I was never so surprised in all my life to see what I saw. I couldn't believe that the country had progressed so far in, well, of course, it was roughly 60 years, but still. I like to say that when I left Korea, it was basically rice-thatched roofs and ox carts. When I went back, it was all high-rise and Hyundai.
What were you thinking when you left for USA, returned back to your home? Did you see any future of Korea? Did you see that this people and this country would get out of this demolitions, destructions, and poverties and miserable?
I really didn't think it would now. I assumed they would progress to some extent, but I had no idea it would progress to the state it's in now. In fact, as I mentioned before, we had this Korean couple, middle-aged couple, that did laundry for us. And I'd sit and talk with him quite often. And he said, when this war ends, I want to build a hotel here on Koje-do. He said, I want a hotel where people can come and see what happened here. And I thought, that'd be nice, however. I hope he did. I hope his dream came true. Koje-do, when I left there, it was one basically small village that was dirt streets, nothing modern. I never saw a motorized vehicle. It was all ox carts. And I thought Korea, Koje-do, when I went back, I was thinking, it's going to be pretty much the same. I couldn't believe Koje-do. When my wife and I, when we got to Busan, in fact, we took the KTX train, KTX train, which was an amazing trip on that high-speed train to Busan. Then we took the ferry boat from Busan to Korea, to Koje-do. And when we pulled into the harbor of Koje-do, I was just totally amazed at what I saw. It was just totally built. And I just couldn't believe it. And we went to, they had reconstructed the prison camp to some extent.
Mm-hmm.
And it was just outstanding what they've done to preserve the memory of the prison. And we were just totally amazed. We just thoroughly enjoyed our trip back. It was just such a thrill to see how well Korea had progressed. I was so happy that I was maybe just a little tiny part of it. These little kids that I have in the picture where I gave them oranges and apples or candy, those kids are all in their 60s now. I wonder what happened.
What is the legacy of the Korean War?
I think the war, unfortunate as the war is, I hate war. To me, a war is the most senseless thing ever devised, basically. But the war in South Korea gave these people hope. Once the American troops went, actually troops from around the world went to Korea and pushed the communists back. I think it gave the people of Korea a sense of obligation and a sense of to fulfill what has taken place up to that point. They had the determination then to turn their country around and make it a modern, basically, at that period of time, Korea was, what would I call it? They had no drive. They had no. I don't think they had a spirit to go ahead. And I think the war turned them around completely. Because I recall Incheon, I recall Daegu, Busan. The homes most of the buildings were all straw thatched roofs, mud streets. And what they did in a short 50 years, it's totally amazing, totally amazing. I'm so happy that they had the determination to put themselves in the position they are now, basically leading the world in so many ways. We went over there as basically most of us went over there not knowing what Korea was, where Korea was, anything about it. But to come back and then to see what's happened as a result of the intervention of the United States and the countries from around the world that went. The intervention of those countries to the basically small country of Korea, of South Korea. What it has meant to that country. What has grown from our experiences. It's just, I think every one of us are just so pleased of what's happened. I know I am. I didn't want to go at first back to Korea. I was afraid to go. But I thought if I go back, it's going to open up things that I've closed off. But I'm so glad I went.
Thank you very much again.
Thank you.